I want to welcome everyone for our next episode of In Conversation With. I'm Anne Callis, I'm the GCC Director based in Dubai, and today I'm in conversation with Amy Blackwell. Amy is a partner in Acorn Capital Advisors, and she is a philanthropy, impact investment and multi-generational wealth expert. She basically helps families to use their wealth purposefully, and she actually engages the next generation into that conversation. So that's when we had a first talk, that actually got us talking about next generation. And as a forward-thinking jurisdiction like Jersey, we need to understand next generation so that we keep up to date and we don't fall behind. And we were talking about everything, next-gen employees, next-gen clients. And it made me realize actually that I still considered myself a next-gen employee, but after 20 years of working, I wasn't that next gen anymore. And there's big generations after me that have joined the workforce. And one that came just after me, I'm Gen X, is Millennials. And then Amy actually put me on the spot and asked me, how well do I know Millennials? And I said, very well. I've got friends, I've got colleagues, they're Millennials, I know them very well. So she said, so how are they different? And then actually, I realized I actually didn't know that much about the Millennials, because I think the first thing I could think about is they take more selfies than I do. They prefer Instagram to Facebook. And then the big thing everybody says when they're talking about next gen is they're probably more environmentally conscious, but basically further than that, I didn't get. So I thought this would be a very good episode to actually delve into this generation coming after Gen X, the Millennials, and to talk to an expert. And that's why I have Amy with me this morning. Thank you again, Amy. So let's just start. What do make Millennials different to their previous generations?
Thanks, Anne, for having me. I'm really happy to be here, and it's a topic that I find infinitely interesting and actually really exciting. And so I feel like it's my mission when I talk about millennial generation to, show a tremendous amount of optimism, because I think that this generation is going to do great things. But in order to really understand what makes them tick, I think of it in terms of a metaphor, which I call beach glass. And if you know what beach glass is, it's, a piece of broken glass that ends up in the oceans, and forces act on that glass. And the glass actually changes its composition and becomes something wholly different. And in the case of beach glass, the forces acting on it are the sun and the sand and the salt and the water and the waves. And it ends up being something incredibly unique and beautiful and highly coveted, actually. And I think that it's an interesting way to think of millennials, because they also have been shaped and changed by forces. And in their instance, I think there are four things that have really changed the way they see the world and the way that they behave. And one is in their lifetime, they've seen the failure of many institutions that had previously been held up to very high standards. Governments have failed them, banks have failed, financial institutions have put, profit before clients. There have been lots of scandals that have been throughout their formative years. The second thing is that there's been disappointment in their leaders, whether it's leaders of companies or leaders of governments. There have been scandals. There have been questions of ethics. There have been questions of, whose priority should be the priority. And that has changed how they look at people in positions of authority. They don't just automatically grant someone respect because of a position they hold. Someone needs to earn that. The third thing is that they've been taught differently. There's been a change in what is called pedagogy over the last 25 years. And in schools, our students are taught by teams often, or they learn in teams. And what they learn from that is that each person brings a skill set to a learning process, and they're not all the same. And so what this generation has learned how to do is build effective groups of people, build teams, and accept that they don't actually have to know everything, but they need to know where their strengths are so that they can then build a team that complements their strengths and realize that then the rising tide lifts the whole team. And that's a really important thing to remember when you think about how they engage with advisors and their peers and their employees and employers. And the last thing that has really affected them, in my view, is they've spent their life with video games of one sort or another. And that sounds like a trivial thing, but it is actually not, because what video games do is they take away the fear of failure, because it is an iterative process to get good at a video game. And so you learn from your mistakes. You know, you go down a blind alley and you're trying to get away from someone and you turn left and the villain eats you, and you learn, you know, okay, when I go down that blind alley, I'm now going to turn right. But the difference in the generations is not that they're afraid of failure, but they're willing to share their failure with others and with peers and help others learn from their own failures. And I find that very interesting because, you know, there has been in previous generations a sense that the most important thing you could do was hide your failures because it would hold you back. Whereas in this generation, you know, the things that they learn from and the things that don't go well are the things that end up in their social media. It's what they share with each other. And from that, they collectively get a general group knowledge that is growing and growing. And when you take the shame out of it, you realize that failure itself is a gift. I mean, you don't learn from the things that go perfectly, you learn from the things that go off on a tangent. So because of those things, there are certain meta trends that we see that are associated with millennials. And I'm just going to go through a few of them, but, you know, feel free to jump in if you have any questions or if anything's not clear. I mean, one thing is, I think that's fundamental is that they are, as a group, they're purpose driven, and they believe that there should be alignment between their purpose and profit, their values. There should be alignment in thinking within the organizations where they work, within their friend groups, within their investments. So, you know, understanding that that their wealth and their education and their experiences are tools. They're not their identity. They are the ability to propel themselves toward a goal. And you learn how to use a tool. I mean, no one is born knowing how to use it. But you also don't take a tool out of a toolbox and start using it without knowing what you want to build. So what this purpose-driven view of the world helps them determine which tools do they need and how are they going to use it. And they learn from each other. And I think that's a really powerful thing to remember when we think about the things that this generation wants to accomplish. They have an incredibly deep sense of civic responsibility. As a percentage of the population, they vote at a very high rate. They want to be heard, and they use the power they have with their voice, whether it's their voice in an election with their vote or social media, but it has changed the way elections are being run. I mean, social media is a part of elections in a way that, you know, my generation would never have imagined. So they are using that voice and that collective community in a really positive and impactful way. They're also incredibly conscious consumers. I mean, they will name and shame, and they will pull companies out and say, you know, you said this, but this is what you're doing, and, you know, you need to be held accountable. And that all goes back to those forces that have shaped them, with institutions and leaders not living up to the standards that they would set for them. Another part that I think is really interesting is that they really believe that there's no shame in profit. There's nothing wrong with a business making a profit. But what they believe is that businesses should be purpose-driven, and they should be tied to stakeholders, and they should have a net positive impact on the world. And they choose to engage with employers who they believe are operating in that manner, organizations that they will give their allegiance to, products they will buy. And that shared purpose and shared expectation has been a great example of that. Is if you look at the movement towards shared intellectual property, I mean, we wouldn't have the vaccine that we have now if the trends toward open IP and shared information hadn't happened, because people in the past would work in a vacuum. They wanted the congratulations and the profits and the personal credit for having done something. But now there is a sense with this community-driven, purpose-led objectives that we can do more together collectively with the minds than we can individually. And that underpins a lot of what they do. Another thing I think I would say is that when they look at solutions, they really do believe in social capital and giving vulnerable populations a voice. And so when they look at solutions, whether they're products or services or philanthropy or impact investments, they want a sustainable solution. They want to go into it with a teach them to fish attitude rather than feed them a fish. Because the idea is that once they have intervened and once they've engaged, they want the people to be able to handle their own lives and have the voice in what will be a successful future for themselves, rather than a propped up system where, you know, some sort of development organization has to feed them for the next 20 years. And so that's a real fundamental shift. And oftentimes those teach them to fish solutions are not actually a large charitable organization. They are a social enterprise, or they are a small business, or they are micro lending so that people can have the support to do their own products or companies or services. So, I mean, I think I'll stop there and see if there's any questions, because it's just, you know, as far as I'm concerned, there's just so much interesting about this generation that faces the issues that we have right now in such a really incredible way that you'll kind of have to stop me.
That actually made a lot of sense, and I actually do see the difference with previous generations. I think I probably myself was less purpose driven, the failure of institutions, and maybe not the authority figures that have let them down. I think we can all see that even just the past few years. But if you then work with a millennial, like let's say I'm a wealth advisor and I'm working with a client that is a millennial, how should I approach them? What can I do to give them the service they expect in their worldview?
Thank you for that question. That's actually really interesting, because there's some really scary data for advisors. I mean, the data that came out, I believe it was in 2018 or 2019, said that 90% of millennials and next gen who will become heirs to fortunes will change advisors within 90 days of inheriting. So if you think as an organization that a family's been with you for generations, and so, you know, you are so embedded in that family, then, you know, you are sadly mistaken, because people are making changes. They're saying they want to operate with their wealth and their values and their impact in a different way. And one interesting way that we see, there are lots of apps and groups where this generation has pushed very hard to democratize access. And so there is a sense of discomfort with inherited wealth among many people. That discrepancy of wealth between the haves and the have-nots has actually been exacerbated in a significant way by the pandemic. And so there's a sense that access to, say, venture capital investments for impact, or just general impact investing, it shouldn't only be accessible by the family office level investors and institutional professional investors. And so there's a huge amount of support for these apps that where you can invest in businesses with micro investments, you know, where the tickets are, you know, a few £100 or £50 or £20, rather than feeling like, you know, it has to be done through a huge organization and the only investors are big institutional clients. And so because of that, advisors need to think differently about the way they deal with the wealth. First of all everything needs to be transparent. Everything. Fees need to be transparent. Structures need to be transparent. Beneficiaries need to be clear. Anything that looks remotely like it is structured for the purpose of tax avoidance or tax minimization, that is just not, it's not okay. There is a real sense that they need to pay their fair share, that they need to have a sense of duty and responsibility, that they need to leave it better than they found it. And they really are embodying that sense of to whom much is given, much is expected. And they expect that from their advisors. So in concrete terms, because of this education change where they work collaboratively with other people in teams, they absolutely want their advisors to work collaboratively in an ecosystem of advisors. They do not want them to operate in a turf war of, that's my client, I'm not, don't go anywhere near my client, because it immediately turns them off. The best thing an advisor can do when they're dealing with millennials is to swim in their own lane. Know the edge of what you know exceptionally well and admit that, because they want people to say, you know what, I am absolutely here for you and I can do these things really well, but I know this person and this person who pick up right where the edge of my knowledge is, and then they will continue that exemplary service for you, and we'll do it collaboratively. So if you have, this is especially interesting with entrepreneurial wealth, and I think in the Middle East, you see a tremendous amount of entrepreneurs, and I think it's something that many people don't know about the Middle East. They're actually the highest concentration of new businesses in young people. And it's a really exciting region. And so because of that, you're going to have people who have liquidity moments, and all of a sudden they're going to have newly generated wealth that is not currently wrapped up in structure. And that is an incredibly exciting time. But an advisor can really ruin the relationship if the first thing they're doing is looking at structuring in a very traditional way. Because before you get to structure, you need to start with purpose. So you need to figure out, what does this wealth mean? This person might be part of a multi-generational family office, and that might be everything they don't stand for. And they may want to have a completely different purpose with this money. They may say that they want to empower other people to be able to start their own businesses. And so they're going to create a VC fund where people can come to them and apply for funding, and they can support them with an advisory group. Well, that's going to require a completely different structural setup for this wealth than if their idea is, I want to maintain this wealth for the next 5 generations, and I never want to touch the principal, I just want it to grow. And I mean, so if you don't have the conversation about the purpose of the tool, then you just start building things, and they aren't fit for purpose. And not only have you cost the client time and money and frustration, but you haven't had an honest dialogue with them. So that's very, very important. I do think that the greenwashing piece is really important, and advisors need to think about the words they use. Words really matter to this generation. So if you're talking about sustainable investments, why, how are you going to measure it? How do you know it's really sustainable? What kind of due diligence are you doing? And you need to understand that you will be held accountable for the claims that you make about the way that you engage. And I also think that you need to remember that these people want to sit across the table and see a peer. So organizations need to work within teams of multiple generations so that when they're sitting there collectively with clients, those young clients can see people who look like them. And it doesn't mean that there can't be a more experienced advisor along, or someone who's worked with the family in the past, but you need to make a commitment that this organization of advisors is building their own next generation, and that those relationships are really important. And they're not just carrying the briefcase. They're actually there as a critical team member. And another thing that I think really needs to be dealt with, and I'm sure you know about it from your work on Jersey, but trustees need to figure out how to manage their risk appetite for impact investing and the potential for concessionary returns. Because we're seeing that with many impact investments, the returns are at market rate. So you aren't actually conceding anything. But there is a fear in some trustee circles that their responsibility to bring the highest possible financial returns within the risk appetite it impedes them from making an investment where there is the potential for a concessionary return. And so whether that means that the trustees are looking at their duty of care for the well-being of beneficiaries, and the impact is more important in that view than the financial return, and that can mitigate the risk, whatever that is, that needs to be talked about and it needs to be understood, because there is nothing but frustration when next gen wealth holders say, I really care about this, I want to invest in this, and then the trustees say, yeah, no, we aren't allowed to do that, we can't do that. So embedding language about impact investing and concessionary returns and well-being into new structures is really important. And modifying structures where possible to give peace of mind to the advisors is a very good step toward engaging in the types of investments millennials want to see.
Thank you. That was, again, a very, very good point. But sometimes when you have a family, there's already a machine working that is generating the wealth. And how do you then practically do it? How do you get purpose into the machine? And how do you get maybe the older generation to get to also be on board with the purpose, or you don't get the next generation? And how do you get that next generation on at the table?
I find that this work that you put in the front end on purpose is the best thing you can do to bring a family together. So if there is existing wealth that has come from previous generations, one of the most important things is to stop and look backward and figure out what was the source of the money. How did it come to be? If it was entrepreneurial wealth a couple generations ago, then, assuming that person who generated the initial wealth is no longer alive, then you need to do research, right? As a family, you need to look at the business. You want to go back into old minutes from board meetings. You need to unearth what the point of the business was to start with, and identify places where there were failures and opportunities to learn, and try to find the values that went through that business. How did they engage with the local community? How did they engage with stakeholders? What were the initial philanthropic aims of the business? Because depending on which century the business was started in, there were significant contributions by businesses to local communities as just a duty of care for the people that are in the community that they operate in. So looking back and figuring out the legacy of the wealth is really important, because what it does for the generation later is it helps to make those people human. They made mistakes. Things didn't always go well. They almost lost the business. They almost lost the house. Because what happens is as generations go, these people are held up to a higher and higher historical standard. And then you get generations that feel like, well, I'll never be them, so why try? And so if you humanize them and help to show that, actually it was only the third iteration of this business that was successful, the first two were a disaster, well, then all of a sudden, if you have an entrepreneurial spirit in a younger person, they're less afraid to take a chance. And when you've had wealth created, the next generation typically becomes focused on wealth preservation. And when you go to wealth preservation, you tend to have a lower risk appetite. And so then by the time the third generation comes along and that little tiny bit of entrepreneurial spirit is fighting to come out, the wealth preservation, reputationally conservative generation says, no way, that's not what we're about. It's not going to get lost on my watch, and we're not going to embarrass this family. This family is about this person who made all this wealth. We're not going to, ruin their image. So unless you can demonstrate the transition from creation of wealth through preservation of wealth to the next generation, it's hard to get buy-in. So that's really important. If the person who made the wealth is still alive, I am a huge believer in video documentaries with those people. And I think it's so important to sit down and talk about all of the opportunities that they had to learn from failure, what the purpose of their wealth was, what they want it to mean to be part of that family, what they wanted that wealth to be for. And then what you do is you create a shared destination for this family. In the future, we want to be known for this. And the really effective multi-generational families are ones that say, we understand that we're all going to get to that shared destination in a different mode of transportation, on different roads, and at a different speed. And because of that, we're going to bring something incredibly interesting together at that point. And if you try and force everyone to travel the same road in the same car, that's when you get pushback. That's when you get these contentious situations where people just want to be let out of the web of the family wealth. And if you start saying, you know, I understand you're going to get there differently. And in the case of some families, I strongly advise the creation of a venture capital fund in the family office structure so that next gen can come and be treated just like a bank would treat them. They need to put a plan together, needs to be approved. They need to have terms and conditions around the loan. They need to report back. And what families can do then is put an advisory board around that person so that they've got the support they need to be as successful as their business idea can be. And then it becomes a force multiplier within the family because the purpose is still driving the new business. You're creating new wealth. The family's starting to stand for something newer and deeper, and you have buy-in because you've given people a voice and the ability to find their way to the shared destination in their own way and their own time frame. So I think there's really great ways to do it, but it takes communication, and you need to get out of the structure and get out of the conflict and step back. And it's amazing that there's so much more in common when you really start to look at values and purpose than what's different. And then getting over those barriers is a lot easier.
That again is very interesting. And I think I would want to talk for hours and ask you questions, but given the time, I do have one last thing I want to talk to you, because you said at that table there needs to be next gen, but also on the advisor side, there needs to be a next generation of advisors. But the millennial employee, I actually just heard a podcast about this, and they were talking about career skepticism, like we were brought up saying you need to work, save money, and then you retire. But they, like you said, actually, they've seen these institutions fail, big bank institutions fail. Lots of people that have worked really hard, seen their savings. So they now look different on their career. Could you go back into that? Because as a jurisdiction like Jersey, we also need to invest in our next gen financial workforce. So how do you deal with millennial employees?
Thanks, Anna. That's a really interesting topic, because it defies the logic of the people who are currently in the executive roles in the businesses in many instances. There was recently actually a survey that was done by Gallup, and I'm going to look down at my notes for a second so I make sure I give the right information. But basically, they compared four groups. One was young millennials and Gen Z, so between 1989 and 2001. Older millennials, 1980 to 1988. Gen X, which is 1965 to 79, and baby boomers. And they asked them to prioritize within an employer's what was most important to them. And the millennials, both camps of millennials, answered that it was that the organization cared about employees' well-being. The Gen X, so 65 to 70, they wanted to know that the leadership was ethical, as did the baby boomers. So that to me is really interesting. But the second most important thing for millennials was the ethical behavior, because they were looking at, how do I feel? How does this organization line up with my values? And oftentimes we forget that, the executive might have plans and edicts from on high, but the experience of a millennial as they're moving through an organization is their own line manager. So to say an organization's leadership is ethical, they may never engage with the leadership of the organization. So what they're thinking about is, do the people who engage with me in my job every day, do they care about my well-being? And that, I think, is a really interesting part of it, because they want to feel that there's a connection. They don't want a work balance, a work life and a home life. They want it all together and for it to all be making sense. And they also have grown up with diversity and inclusion as part of their lives. It's becoming more and more important to them. They believe that organizations and teams produce better results and create better environments when there is diversity and inclusion happening automatically. It's not happening because there is a policy. And having all of those different viewpoints and perspectives at the table is an incredibly impactful way to make organizational decisions, because it's empathetic. And there's that sense of empathy and collectiveness and optimism. And, recently, this week, I believe it was, Colin Powell died. And he was really a pretty heroic person in the US. And he has, I would encourage everybody to look up his 13 rules of leadership, because one of them is that contagious optimism is a force multiplier. And I think that this generation of millennials has a can-do attitude. They have a, well, why can't we do that? And why can't we build technology and have innovation and make these changes? And within their employment, they push back a lot. They say, well, why can't we change that? Why can't we break down that bureaucratic structure? Why can't we all have a voice? And that optimism, I think, is going to propel us towards solving these problems that we have in the world, in the environment, in cultures, in politics that feel like they're insurmountable. And I do believe that this collective effort, being purpose-led and being optimistic, will be incredibly important to us solving some of these issues.
Well, thank you again, Amy. That optimism, contagious optimism, is a very good note to actually end this conversation. I thought you had really good insights, and it helped me understanding millennials better, and I hope for the people watching as well. So thank you very much, Amy, and see you on the next episode.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great pleasure.